James Carter, a 32-year-old black man, stands at the corner of 7th Street, overlooking the bustling streets of the city he calls home. A tall, lean figure with a quiet, authoritative presence, James's calm demeanor often hides the weight of the world he carries. With short-cropped hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that have seen too much yet still hold a spark of hope, he's a man of contradictions. He is both the protector and the silent observer, someone who has learned to navigate the tension between the public persona and the internal struggles he faces daily. His smile, often reserved for those closest to him, is a reflection of his belief in humanity, even when the world around him frequently tests that faith. Born and raised in a neighborhood where injustice often looms larger than opportunity, James is no stranger to the harsh realities of life. He carries the weight of racial prejudice and stereotypes with a quiet resilience. Every day, he walks the fine line between the man he wishes to be, one who stands for justice, compassion, and community, and the man society too often sees him as just another black man fighting for a place in a world that often does not welcome him. His reputation as a community activist, someone who lends a hand to those in need, has earned him the respect of many. But it hasn't shielded him from the deep-seated biases of the system or the everyday people he interacts with. Still, James holds on to the belief that doing good, no matter how small, is a fight worth engaging in, even if the odds are stacked against him. But as with all heroes, his values are tested constantly, and the tension of this fight is always simmering just beneath the surface. Every morning, James wakes up at 5:30 a.m. to start his day. The first rays of sunlight filter through the small window in his apartment, casting a warm glow on the hardwood floors. He doesn't need an alarm to rise. His body, conditioned over the years, wakes him in time to prepare for the long day ahead. He stretches, silently acknowledging the weariness in his bones, a reminder of the countless hours he spends advocating for his community. James starts each day with a moment of solitude, drinking his coffee in silence, mentally preparing for whatever challenges he might face. His job as a community liaison for a local nonprofit organization keeps him busy. From working with at-risk youth to organizing food drives, his routine is never the same, but it always revolves around helping those in need. Despite his own struggles, he devotes himself entirely to the cause. After his morning rituals, he heads to the office, where he meets with city officials, school counselors, and local businesses to secure resources and make meaningful changes. It's exhausting work, but it's work he believes in. After hours, James often spends his evenings walking the neighborhood, visiting families, and checking in on people he's come to know over the years. He's their voice when they have none, their advocate in a city where they often feel invisible. His reputation is solid. People trust him, but they also watch him closely, knowing that as a black man in a city full of tension, his every move could be scrutinized. Yet he pushes forward, driven by the belief that his actions, small as they may seem, can lead to a greater impact. James lives in a neighborhood that is a patchwork of old brick buildings, narrow alleyways, and streetlights that flicker to life only after dark. The air here is thick with the smell of street food and exhaust fumes, a stark contrast to the quiet luxury of the downtown area, just a few miles away. Here in this neighborhood, there's a constant hum of activity, but beneath it all, there's an undercurrent of unease, tension that's hard to shake. James's block, once thriving with families and businesses, has become a place where opportunity is scarce and danger is ever present. The neighborhood is predominantly black, with a few Latinx and Asian families scattered throughout. The sense of community is strong, and the people look out for each other, but the streets tell a different story. Police presence is frequent, but it's often more about control than protection. James has witnessed firsthand how quickly a situation can escalate, how quickly he, just another black man, can be seen as a threat, no matter his intentions. The local school where James volunteers regularly is a place where kids learn resilience in ways no child should have to. It's a place where dreams are forged against a backdrop of broken systems, underfunded classrooms, and teachers who do their best, but are fighting an uphill battle. The neighborhood is home to single mothers, elderly residents, and young people trying to find their way in a world that often overlooks them. The weight of systemic racism is felt at every turn, whether it's in the job market, the education system, or the justice system. Yet, despite all this, James sees the beauty in his neighborhood, the strength of the people, the passion of the youth, and the quiet dignity of those who remain hopeful despite it all. But the environment is more than just a physical setting. It's a reminder to James every day that he's caught in a battle, both for his own survival and for the future of the community he holds dear. And as much as he wants to bring change, he knows that the world will continue to challenge him in ways he can't predict. As James walks through the neighborhood, a feeling of unease stirs within him. There's been an uptick in police patrols lately, and the tension is palpable. People walk with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with officers who move with purpose, eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. James knows that the air is thick with suspicion. Though he's done nothing wrong, he feels the weight of being black in this environment, where every step could be misinterpreted, every gesture scrutinized. Earlier that day, he overheard a conversation between two of the local shop owners about the recent rise in police activity. "They're looking for something," one of them had said, "and it's not good for people like us." James had felt a chill run through him. The talk of increased police presence, the tension in the air, it all pointed to something coming, something that would challenge the very values he's fought for. He had no idea what it would be yet, but he knew that soon enough, the conflict would become impossible to ignore. The question lingered in his mind. Would he remain the hero the community believed him to be? Or would he be forced to confront the harsher realities of a world that often judged him for the color of his skin? The storm was coming, and James could feel the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It was a typical afternoon in the neighborhood. James had just finished his shift at the local community center, his mind preoccupied with the evening's plans for a youth mentorship program. He was walking down the same familiar streets, heading toward the local corner store to grab a quick drink. His routine was comforting, like a well-worn path through a forest, predictable and secure. But as he turned the corner, his usual calm was shattered by a sudden scream, a shrill cry that cut through the air, sending a jolt of adrenaline through his body. He instinctively turned toward the sound, his heart racing. Near the edge of the sidewalk, a white child no older than 8 was running frantically away from a speeding car that had lost control. The car swerved off the road and hurtled toward the child, its tires screeching against the pavement. Without thinking, James shot into action. His body moved faster than his mind could process, propelled by years of experience looking out for others in his community. He dashed across the road, his legs pumping with urgency, and reached the child just in time. With one swift motion, he grabbed the little boy, pulling him out of the car's path, narrowly avoiding the vehicle that smashed into the streetlight just behind them. The child, wide-eyed and trembling, clung to him as James shielded him from the danger, his heart pounding in his chest. James felt a surge of relief as the car finally came to a stop. His hand still firmly held the child, keeping him close, protecting him from the chaos that had unfolded in mere seconds. In the brief moments that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath. James's chest heaved as he gently reassured the child, but his eyes flicked nervously to the gathering crowd that had already begun to take in the scene. There was no mistaking it. James had just done something extraordinary, something heroic. Yet, in the back of his mind, a gnawing thought began to take root. This moment, this heroism wasn't just about saving a child. It was going to pull him into something far larger and more dangerous. James stood there, his body still tense, the adrenaline beginning to wear off. The child clutched at his sleeve, still shaking, but beginning to calm down under James's steady presence. But as the reality of what had just happened settled over him, so did a wave of conflicting emotions. The immediate rush of satisfaction, of having saved a life, was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of unease. He looked around, seeing the bystanders who had witnessed the incident. There were murmurs, some expressing awe, others unsure of how to react. James could feel the weight of their stares, some sympathetic, others perhaps a little too calculating. He had saved the child, yes, but the implications of the moment were beginning to sink in. What would happen now? Would this act of heroism be celebrated or turned into something darker? James had grown accustomed to the harsh realities of living as a black man in a racially charged world. His actions, no matter how selfless, could be misconstrued. He could already feel the unease that seemed to ripple through the crowd, a sense of judgment that lingered just beneath the surface. Would they view him as a hero, or would he be seen as a threat, a figure to be questioned, analyzed, even scrutinized? James's stomach churned. The fear wasn't about the danger he had just faced. It was the fear of what might come next. The child's life had been spared, but would his own safety and peace be shattered by the fallout of this unexpected act? He'd done what anyone would do, but in this world, sometimes doing the right thing was the most dangerous thing of all. As the days passed, the repercussions of James's heroic act began to unfold, appending his once predictable routine. The local news had picked up the story, and the headlines were quick to label him as a local hero. The images of him pulling the child from harm's way were broadcast across the city, splashed across social media, and shared by countless people. At first, the recognition felt good, validating the values he had lived by all these years. But as the buzz around the incident grew, so did the scrutiny. The community, once his supportive base, began to react with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Neighbors who had known James for years now viewed him through a different lens. Some praised him for his quick thinking, for risking his life to save a child, but others whispered about the implications of his race. What if he had done something else? Some people wondered. What if he'd reacted differently? It was the kind of doubt that, though unspoken, was very real. Then came the police. Officers arrived at James's apartment one evening, asking questions. They wanted to know everything about what had happened that day, how the car had swerved, why he had been there in the first place. They seemed more interested in his story than in the facts of the accident itself. James, accustomed to the uneasy interactions with law enforcement, answered their questions, but felt an underlying tension in the air. The questioning felt invasive, even accusatory, as though his actions, his heroism, were being scrutinized for something more than their face value. As the days wore on, James couldn't escape the growing discomfort that accompanied him wherever he went. The routine that had once felt so familiar now felt foreign. He couldn't walk down the street without eyes following him. The feeling of being watched, of being evaluated in ways that went beyond what he had done, was all-consuming. The incident that had begun as an act of heroism now pulled him deeper into a world of uncertainty and scrutiny, forcing him to confront the reality that even the most selfless acts could lead to consequences that were impossible to predict. As the news cycle spun faster, the incident that had once seemed like a moment of pure heroism quickly turned into a maelstrom of tension. The initial media frenzy, which had painted James as a savior, began to shift. Journalists hungry for a new angle began to ask questions about his past, digging into his history with law enforcement, his relationships with local leaders, and his reputation in the community. What had started as praise now seemed to carry a sinister edge, as if the act of saving the child could be twisted into something else. The police, too, had a role in this growing discomfort. They had initially questioned James thoroughly after the incident, but now their interest seemed to shift toward a different kind of inquiry. The questioning grew more insistent. Why had he been on that particular street at that time of day? What had drawn him to the scene of the accident? The officers' eyes lingered on him in a way that suggested they weren't merely interested in facts. They were interested in motives. James felt his anxiety rise as he listened to the questions. It wasn't just the police. It was the way people looked at him, as though his actions, his very existence, could be a threat in the wrong context. The assumption that a black man could never be a hero without ulterior motives was creeping into every conversation, every report. In the hours following the incident, James had learned that the driver of the car was a white man who had been drinking, and that the child's family was politically influential in the area. This fueled the growing narrative that the incident wasn't as simple as it seemed. The public was split. Some defended James, recognizing the heroism in his actions, while others, less sympathetic, questioned his presence, his intent, and even his right to be hailed as a hero. The local news anchors, eager to keep viewers engaged, began to insinuate that James had acted impulsively, that his history, his background, might have led to a more dramatic intervention than necessary. The discourse shifted from praise to suspicion, and the simmering racial tensions in the city began to boil over, with James at the center of it all. The shifting narrative wasn't lost on James's family and friends. His older sister, Mariah, who had always been a pillar of support, reacted with immediate concern. She'd seen the way the media was twisting the facts, and the way the police had treated James during their interviews. "James, you've got to be careful," she said one evening when they sat together on the porch. "This world isn't going to let you be a hero. They're going to try to turn you into something else." Her words stung, but James knew she was right. Mariah had grown up with a deep awareness of the racial dynamics in their neighborhood, and her caution came from a place of experience. She feared for his safety, not just physically but socially. People who lived in their community didn't forget easily. She worried that the attention James was receiving would eventually lead to a backlash that could spiral out of control. But then there was Marcus, James's best friend, who saw things differently. Marcus had a more optimistic view. "Look, man, you did the right thing. Don't let them take that away from you," he insisted. "You saved that kid's life. Nobody can take that from you." Marcus's unwavering belief in James's good intentions was comforting, but James could sense a quiet tension beneath the surface. Marcus, for all his good-hearted optimism, didn't understand the weight that came with being a black man in a city that was quick to turn a hero into a villain. Then there was Tiffany, the mother of the child James had saved. She reached out to him after the incident, wanting to thank him personally. Her gratitude was genuine, but there was something unsettling about the way she clung to the idea of James as a savior. It felt as if her perception of him was being defined by that one moment, and not by the reality of who he was, a complex person with struggles and flaws, just like anyone else. As the days passed, James found himself caught between the varying opinions of those close to him. Mariah's warnings clashed with Marcus's insistence on focusing on the positive, and Tiffany's gratitude felt almost transactional. He realized that, no matter how many people stood by him, the larger world outside was shaping his story in ways he couldn't control. James woke up every morning to a pit in his stomach. His once peaceful life had been consumed by the aftermath of the heroic act. He found himself replaying that moment over and over in his mind. The split second when he saw the car bearing down on the child, the rush of fear, and then the surge of adrenaline as he acted. At the time, it had been instinctual. He had done what anyone would do. But now, that moment felt like a millstone around his neck. The media had changed the narrative. His actions were no longer about saving a life. They were about race, about his background, about the assumption that a black man couldn't be a hero without some hidden agenda. The racial undertones of the coverage were impossible to ignore. There were whispers about how aggressive his rescue had been, how out of control the situation had been. It was as if the world was determined to make him feel guilty for doing what was right. James began to question himself in ways he never had before. What if they were right? What if his actions hadn't been as noble as he believed? What if he had been reckless? He had always been proud of his commitment to justice, to helping others, but now that same commitment felt like a heavy burden. He couldn't stop thinking about the way people looked at him, those sideways glances, the way the police had questioned him so intensely. Did they see him as a hero? Or was he just a target now? The emotional toll was taking a physical toll too. James was losing sleep, his mind too consumed with worry to rest properly. His thoughts spiraled into self-doubt, and he found himself lashing out at the people closest to him. At Mariah, at Marcus, even at Tiffany. It was the small things that hurt the most. When he walked down the street now, he noticed how people avoided his gaze, how they crossed the street rather than walking past him. His chest tightened every time a car drove by a little too fast, and he began to feel the weight of every unfamiliar face, as though they were all waiting for him to slip up. The anxiety built with each passing day, and the feeling of being watched, judged, scrutinized, became all-consuming. His internal struggle was one of alienation. He had always fought for what was right, for justice, for the greater good, but in this moment, he felt powerless. The system, the media, the public, they all had the ability to twist his actions, to turn him into something he wasn't. He realized that the battle he was facing wasn't just against external judgment. It was against the very forces that had shaped his life, forces that had always sought to limit what he could achieve based on nothing more than the color of his skin. James knew that things were only going to get worse. The small town he had always called home was now a battleground, and he was at the center of it. As his internal turmoil continued to grow, he began to hear rumors of a public hearing scheduled for the following week, a forum where the incident would be debated publicly. The police were planning to present the case in front of a committee, one that would determine whether James's actions had been justified or whether he had overstepped his bounds. The pressure of the hearing loomed like a dark cloud, and James could feel the weight of it on his shoulders. The idea of facing the public scrutiny, of having his heroism questioned in front of an audience, was suffocating. He could already feel the walls closing in around him. It wasn't just about the legal ramifications anymore. It was about how he would be remembered, about whether his actions would be twisted into something else entirely. Would he emerge from this with his dignity intact, or would he become the villain in his own story? As James prepared for what was to come, he knew that the climax of this battle, the moment when his beliefs and his identity would be tested to their limits, was fast approaching. The true cost of his heroism was yet to be revealed. The day of the public hearing arrived, and with it, a crushing wave of dread. James stood before the assembly in the cold, sterile atmosphere of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters, police officers, and local officials. The entire town was watching. His every word, every gesture, felt like it was under a magnifying glass, and James could feel the weight of the scrutiny bearing down on him. He had expected hostility, but the extent of it was overwhelming. The prosecution painted him as a reckless figure, an unpredictable element whose past was filled with questionable decisions. His heroism that day, the decision to save the child, was being questioned, and his very motivations were up for debate. They tried to pin his actions as a result of irrational impulse rather than a clear-headed decision. The defense, on the other hand, had tried to hold the line, but their case felt weak compared to the mounting pressure from the opposition. As James took his turn to speak, he felt the room close in on him. The questions were aimed not at his intentions, but at his character, his race. What kind of man makes a decision like this on the spot? What is your history with the police? How do we know this wasn't some form of vengeance on your part? They asked, their words like daggers aimed at his dignity. He tried to keep his composure, but his thoughts raced. Was this how he would be remembered? Was the truth of his act of heroism being twisted, reduced to something dark and malicious? The tension in the room was palpable as James struggled to find his voice. It was more than just defending his actions. It was about defending his very right to exist as a black man in a society that seemed determined to find fault with his every move. As the room turned hostile and the questions grew more accusatory, James's mind began to unravel. This wasn't just about saving a child. This was about his place in a world that would never fully see him as a hero. Just when it seemed that the hearing couldn't get any worse, a surprising revelation was made. The prosecutor, in a bid to further discredit James, brought up the family of the child. James had saved the life of a white child, Tiffany's daughter, and it seemed to be the focal point of the debate. But what James didn't know, what no one knew, was that the child's father was connected to the local police department. It turned out that Tiffany's husband, a respected figure in the community, had been a former officer himself, and his connection to the police force was more than just professional, it was personal. Tiffany had been married to him for years, and he had quietly withdrawn from the force after an incident in which he had been accused of racial profiling. The family had kept this detail hidden from the public, but it now came to light during the proceedings. James's stomach dropped when he heard this. The child he had saved, the very life he had put his own on the line for, was tied to a man whose past was fraught with the very kind of systemic injustice James had fought against his whole life. His impulse to save the child suddenly felt less like a pure act of heroism and more like a key piece in a larger, more complicated puzzle. The twist was subtle, but devastating. The prosecutor's line of questioning now took on a new dimension. Do you think, perhaps, you were motivated by a personal vendetta against the police? Did your actions have something to do with this family's ties to the department? They asked. The revelation was a shock to James. He had acted purely out of instinct, out of a desire to protect, not knowing that the child's family had this hidden connection to a world that had often treated him with disdain. Was he now being painted as part of a bigger political game, a pawn in a narrative he had never intended to play a part in? The revelation hit James like a tidal wave. His entire sense of self, the righteousness of his decision, began to fracture under the weight of this new information. He had always prided himself on doing what was right. The child had been in danger, and he had acted. Simple. But now he was faced with a moral quandary. Was his selfless act being co-opted by forces beyond his control? Was his heroism nothing more than a pawn in a battle he hadn't even realized was being waged? As the room buzzed with whispers and murmurs, James felt his world collapsing in on itself. His hands shook. His throat felt tight. He had been so sure of his actions. He had acted out of instinct and love for another human being. But now, everything felt clouded by doubt. Was his desire to be seen as a hero clouding his judgment? Was he being manipulated into believing he was something he was not? In that moment, the weight of societal expectations crushed him. He had always been the person who fought for justice, who believed in doing right by others, but now he wasn't sure what that meant anymore. It was as if the very idea of justice, of fairness, was being twisted and distorted beyond recognition. What was the truth of the matter now? Had he really saved the child, or had he been swept up in something larger, something darker? The realization struck him with painful clarity. His life, his very identity, was being redefined by the world around him. He wasn't just James, a man who had saved a child. He was James, the black man who had acted in a world where every action, every decision, was viewed through the lens of race. His heroism had been turned into a political tool, and he was nothing more than a pawn in a game he hadn't even agreed to play. But in the midst of this revelation, a new understanding began to emerge. James understood now that he would never be allowed to simply exist as a hero. The world would always try to make him something else, something dangerous, something undeserving. But in that moment, as he stood before the court and faced the tide of public opinion, he realized that this, too, was part of the struggle. The truth wasn't just in the act itself. It was in how he responded to the lie being told about him. He clenched his fists, a quiet determination rising within him. No matter how the world tried to twist his story, he would stand firm in who he was. His actions, his truth would be enough. He would no longer allow the system to define him. It was time to redefine the terms of his heroism on his own terms. James knew that his journey was far from over. Although the court case had ended, the fight for justice continued. With a newfound clarity about the racial biases that had tainted his initial act of heroism, he felt a deep sense of responsibility, not just for his own actions, but for the larger conversation that had begun in his community. Determined to take action, James started speaking out publicly, using his experience to fuel his activism. He attended town hall meetings, engaging with both local leaders and the public, pushing for accountability in the police force and greater transparency in how cases like his were handled. He used his voice to challenge the institutional biases that perpetuated racial inequality, not just in the criminal justice system, but in every facet of society. Though some people continued to hold negative views of him, others began to listen. In his speeches, James was careful not to spread anger, but to encourage understanding. "We all have biases," he said in one of his most impactful addresses. "But we also have the power to change. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for justice, for everyone." This appeal to the common good resonated with some, sparking difficult but necessary conversations across the town. In the quiet moments, James also reached out to Tiffany, the mother of the child he had saved. They met several times, their conversations raw, but healing. James expressed his desire to help her family and to rebuild trust where it had been fractured. Tiffany, too, had struggled with her own realizations about systemic racism and privilege, and their discussions helped her heal as well. Through this connection, James realized that forgiveness wasn't just about moving on from pain. It was about transforming that pain into strength. In the months that followed, James's transformation was apparent not just in his actions, but in his perspective. He no longer saw the world solely through the lens of anger and frustration, though those emotions were still present. Instead, he began to see the possibility of change, the small steps that, when taken collectively, could shift the trajectory of his community's mindset. The case had forced him to confront a painful truth: that racial justice was not simply about one act of heroism or one individual's victory. It was a larger systemic issue that required constant vigilance. Yet, in this realization, James also found a new sense of purpose. He no longer needed validation from society to feel like he was doing the right thing. His cause, fighting for true equality, had become bigger than any personal battle. James also recognized the power of unity. In the face of adversity, he had witnessed the support of those who truly believed in justice, those who understood that the fight wasn't about black or white, but about human dignity. While his immediate circle of friends and family had been torn by the conflict, James began to find allies where he least expected them. A local police officer who had once been a vocal critic of his actions began attending his speeches, seeking understanding rather than condemnation. Through it all, James found that his battle for justice was no longer about the immediate aftermath of one incident. It was a lifelong commitment to making the world better, for his children, for Tiffany's, and for all those who came after. The heroism he had once seen as an isolated act had now become part of a much larger, ever-evolving movement for equality and fairness. As he walked home after one of his rallies, James allowed himself a moment to reflect on how far he had come. The early days had been filled with anger, frustration, and confusion. But now, he had a clearer understanding of his purpose. He had not only fought for the truth of his actions, but had also come to understand the complexities of the fight for racial justice. James knew that the journey was far from over. The societal issues he was working to address weren't something that could be solved in a single hearing, nor with one act of heroism. But the awareness had shifted. The very notion of heroism had been redefined in his mind. Heroism wasn't about individual accolades or public recognition. It was about the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and push for lasting change, even when it meant facing opposition. James reflected on the ripple effects of his journey. He had opened eyes, not just in his community, but within himself. He had gained a deeper understanding of the necessity for collective action in the face of injustice. And he knew, above all, that the fight was worth it, because it was a fight for something greater than himself. One warm afternoon, James returned to the park where he had saved Tiffany's daughter months before. He saw her playing with other children, laughing and running freely. She looked up when she saw him and ran over, her wide eyes full of curiosity. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. It was a small gesture, but to James, it meant everything. This was the future he was fighting for. The future where race and color would no longer divide, where children of all backgrounds could grow up without fear of prejudice. James knelt down to her level, offering a gentle smile. "You're welcome," he said, his voice full of emotion. "You're part of the change, too. We all are." As he stood up, James turned to face the horizon. The weight of his journey settled, but the fire still burning within him. This was just the beginning. His work wasn't done. It would take generations to fully heal the wounds of racial injustice, but the seeds had been planted. And no matter what, he would continue to fight for justice, for truth, and for the future that he knew was possible. Reflect on the themes of this story: racial injustice, heroism, and personal growth. How do we each contribute to the broader fight for equality? And how can we reshape our own understanding of justice? The journey toward societal transformation begins with recognizing the power of our individual actions. Share your thoughts on how we can each contribute to breaking down barriers and building a more just world. Let's keep the conversation going, because change starts with us.